Marcus Davidson hadn't built a tech empire by second-guessing himself, but standing in his Westlake Hills mansion at 38, watching his world crumble in real time, he wondered if every decision had led to this moment of reckoning. 2 years ago, Sarah Davidson had been the brightest lawyer in Austin's legal aid circuit, fighting for the forgotten while carrying twins who would never know their mother's laugh. Preeclampsia had stolen her during an emergency C-section, leaving Marcus with 2 premature sons and a rage that could burn down cities. He'd buried his Methodist faith alongside his wife, replacing prayer with profit margins and Sunday services with board meetings. The twins, Caleb and Connor, bore their mother's gentle eyes, but lived in the shadow of her absence. Caleb had developed selective mutism after the funeral, speaking only in whispers to his brother and, apparently, to their caregiver. Connor watched the world with hypervigilant intensity, always scanning his father's face for signs of the storm that might take away what little family remained. Keisha Williams had appeared 6 months ago through Sarah's old legal aid connections, a 32-year-old woman with an education degree from UT and calloused hands from working 3 jobs. Born in East Austin to a Vietnam veteran father and a mother now battling early-onset dementia, she understood loss in ways Marcus refused to acknowledge. Her faith ran deep as Texas roots, shaped by Sunday mornings at Mount Calvary Baptist and grandmother's whispered prayers over hospital beds. What Marcus didn't know, what no one knew, was that Sarah had spent her final conscious moments not asking for pain medication or expressing fear, but writing a letter hidden in Keisha's Bible. A letter that began, "If you're reading this, I didn't make it, and I need you to promise me something impossible." The Davidson mansion reflected its owner's emotional state: marble floors cold enough to crack, steel appliances that gleamed without warmth, and family photos Sarah had hung that Marcus couldn't bear to remove, but refused to really see. Only Sarah's art studio remained exactly as she'd left it, locked, untouched, a shrine to dreams interrupted. Keisha had brought something dangerous into this controlled environment. The sound of children's laughter, the smell of homemade cookies, and now, most threatening of all, the gentle murmur of bedtime prayers that reminded Marcus of everything he'd lost and everything he'd chosen to abandon. From the kitchen, where she prepared meals that actually got eaten, to the living room where she'd created a corner soft enough for tears, Keisha had been quietly transforming the house from a museum of grief into something that almost resembled a home. She spoke to the boys in the same cadence she'd learned from her grandmother, patient, kind, unafraid of difficult questions or the silence that followed. Marcus had established exactly one rule when he hired her: no religion, no prayers, no Bible stories, no talk of heaven or angels or any of the fairy tales that had failed so spectacularly when he'd needed them most. And now, hearing his sons' voices lifted in something that sounded dangerously close to hope, he realized that rule had just been shattered beyond repair. Marcus entered through the kitchen, his Italian leather shoes clicking against marble that Sarah had picked out during happier times when they'd argued about countertop colors and dreamed of family breakfasts. The sound that stopped him wasn't the usual chaos of 6-year-olds. It was something far more dangerous. Children's laughter, genuine and unguarded, mixed with a woman's voice singing something low and sweet. He followed the melody like a man walking toward his own execution, briefcase growing heavier with each step. Through the archway leading to the living room, he witnessed a scene that violated every boundary he'd established in this house of careful control. Keisha sat cross-legged on the Persian rug his interior designer had assured him was museum quality, her dark hands gentle as she held his son's pale fingers. The 3 of them formed a circle on a carpet worth more than most people's annual salary, and none of them seemed to care about its value. Sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows caught the gold cross at Keisha's throat, jewelry he'd somehow never noticed before, probably because he'd trained himself to see her as furniture rather than a person with beliefs and boundaries of her own. "Now, tell Mama Sarah what made you happy today." Keisha's voice carried the kind of warmth Marcus had forgotten existed in this house. Her East Austin drawl wrapped around his sons like a blanket, and they leaned into it with desperate hunger. Caleb, who hadn't spoken more than necessity demanded since breakfast, suddenly bloomed with language that cut straight through Marcus's chest. "I helped Connor tie his shoes, Mama, and we saw a butterfly that was yellow like your favorite dress. The one Daddy keeps in the closet but won't let us touch." The air left Marcus's lungs. Sarah's sundress, the one she'd worn to their last anniversary dinner, hung in their bedroom closet like a ghost he couldn't exorcise. How did a 6-year-old remember such details? How did he know what his father did in the dark hours when grief felt like drowning? Connor added his small voice to the prayer, and Miss Keisha made pancakes that looked like dinosaurs. And she said, "Maybe you can see us eating them from heaven. Can you, Mama? Can you see us being good boys?" "I believe she can, baby," Keisha whispered. And Marcus watched his son's face transform with something he'd almost forgotten existed, pure, uncomplicated hope. That's when Marcus's corporate voice, honed in boardrooms where weakness meant death, cut through the sacred moment like a chainsaw through silk. "What the hell is this?" Time suspended itself in amber. Three faces turned toward him with expressions that would haunt his dreams. Connor's immediate terror, the way his small body began to shake. Caleb's retreat into the protective silence that had become his fortress. And Keisha's face, shifting from nurturing to fiercely protective as she positioned herself between Marcus and his sons. "Mr. Davidson," she said, rising slowly, hands still gentle, but voice gaining steel. The boys were just... I know exactly what the boys were doing. Marcus's words came out colder than he'd intended, but rage was easier than the alternative. Admitting that hearing his sons speak to their dead mother with such love and longing had cracked something in his chest he'd spent 2 years reinforcing. "You're teaching them to pray. In my house, after I explicitly told you we don't do that here." Keisha's chin lifted with dignity that made Marcus feel smaller than his mansion's towering ceilings. "They need to grieve, Mr. Davidson. They need to remember their mama and know it's okay to miss her." "What they need," Marcus shot back, his voice echoing off marble and steel, "is reality. Not fairy tales about heaven and angels and magical thinking that fails when you need it most." The words tasted like poison, but he couldn't stop them. "They need to learn that dead is dead, and prayer is just talking to yourself." Connor started crying. Not the dramatic wails of a tantrum, but the broken sobs of a child watching his world collapse again. Caleb went completely silent. Retreating so far into himself, Marcus wondered if he'd ever speak again. "Please don't fire me," Keisha said quietly, gathering both boys against her sides. "I didn't mean to overstep. They were asking about their mama, and I thought..." "You thought wrong." Marcus's briefcase hit the floor with a sound like a judge's gavel. "Pack your things. You're done here. Tonight." The twins' desperate pleas hit him like physical blows. "Daddy, no. Please don't send her away. Miss Keisha helps us sleep. She makes the nightmares stop." But Marcus had already turned away, unable to bear the sight of what he was destroying. "They'll adjust," he said to no one in particular. "Children always do." Behind him, Keisha's voice followed him down the hallway, soft but unbreakable. "Love ain't something you adjust to losing, Mr. Davidson. It's something you carry forward." The first week without Keisha unfolded like a slow-motion car crash, each day worse than the last. Marcus hired Mrs. Henderson, a stern woman with 40 years of childcare experience who came with impeccable references and a no-nonsense approach to discipline. She lasted 3 days. "Those boys are damaged goods," she declared on Thursday morning, standing in the marble foyer with her sensible shoes and judgment-filled eyes. "The quiet one won't speak, and the other one follows me around like I'm going to disappear. I don't work with problem children." Marcus stood at his office window that afternoon watching his reflection in glass that cost more per square foot than most people's rent, and tried to convince himself this was temporary. Children were resilient. They adapted. He'd built Tech Flow Industries from nothing by believing in logic over emotion, facts over feelings. Surely the same principles applied to parenting. But logic couldn't explain why Caleb had stopped speaking entirely, not even to Connor. It couldn't account for why Connor had started bedwetting again, something he hadn't done since he was 4. And it certainly couldn't justify the way both boys looked at him now, not with love or trust, but with the careful wariness of animals who'd learned that the hand that fed them could also strike without warning. On day 8, Marcus made the mistake of taking them to Whole Foods. It had seemed simple enough. Keisha always took them grocery shopping and they'd never given her trouble. But without her gentle presence mediating between his impatience and their needs, the expedition turned into a disaster that would haunt him for weeks. Connor's meltdown started in the cereal aisle. One moment he was walking quietly beside the cart, and the next he was on the polished concrete floor screaming with the kind of primal anguish that made other shoppers stop and stare. "I want Miss Keisha." "Daddy, please bring back Miss Keisha. We promise we'll be good." Marcus knelt beside his son, acutely aware of the growing circle of onlookers, their faces mixing concern with judgment. A security guard approached, his hand resting casually on his radio. "Sir, is everything all right here?" "Everything's fine," Marcus said through gritted teeth, trying to lift Connor, who had gone completely limp. "He's just tired." But everything wasn't fine, and everyone in that store could see it. These weren't the tantrums of a spoiled child acting out for attention. This was grief, raw and desperate, pouring out of a 6-year-old who'd already lost his mother and now believed he'd lost the only other person who'd made him feel safe. Caleb tugged at Marcus's sleeve, and when their eyes met, his son whispered the first words he'd spoken in a week. "Daddy, I'm scared." That night, Marcus stood outside the boys' bedroom door at 2 a.m., listening to sounds that made his chest feel like it was caving in. Soft shuffling, muffled sobs, and the unmistakable sound of drawers being opened and closed. When he finally pushed open the door, he found both boys in Sarah's art studio, a room he'd kept locked since her death. They'd somehow picked the lock with a bobby pin from Sarah's vanity, and now Caleb sat at her easel, holding one of her paintbrushes with the reverence of someone touching a holy relic. Connor had curled up in Sarah's reading chair, wrapped in the silk scarf she'd worn on their last date, breathing in the faint scent of her perfume that still clung to the fabric. Both boys were crying with the quiet desperation of children who'd learned that loud grief brought punishment. "We can't remember her voice anymore," Caleb whispered when he saw his father. "Miss Keisha helped us remember, but now it's getting fuzzy. What if we forget her completely?" Marcus felt something crack in his chest. Not break, exactly, but crack like ice beginning to thaw. He knelt beside Sarah's easel, really looking at the painting for the first time since her death. It was a portrait of the boys as newborns, their tiny faces peaceful in sleep, surrounded by brush strokes that seemed to glow with love and hope for a future she'd never see. "Mama was painting this when she went to the hospital," Connor said softly. "Miss Keisha said maybe we could finish it for her, that maybe she'd like that." For the first time since Sarah's funeral, Marcus cried. Not the angry tears of rage and betrayal he'd shed in private, but the broken sobs of a man who'd been carrying grief so heavy it had nearly crushed him. He pulled both boys against him, their small bodies warm and solid and impossibly precious, and finally admitted what he'd been denying for 2 years. He had no idea how to be their father without Sarah to show him the way. At 3 a.m., sitting on his dead wife's studio floor surrounded by her paintings and their children's tears, Marcus Googled child psychologist Austin on his phone. The first article that came up was titled "Helping Children Grieve: Why Memory Matters More Than Moving On." The opening paragraph hit him like a physical blow. Children don't need to get over the death of a parent. They need permission to remember, space to grieve, and trusted adults who won't disappear when their pain becomes inconvenient. The goal isn't to help children forget their loss, it's to help them carry their love forward. Marcus read the entire article twice, then spent another hour reading everything else he could find about childhood grief, selective mutism, and the long-term effects of unprocessed trauma. By dawn, he'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. He was going to find Keisha Williams, swallow his pride, and beg her to come back. Because watching his sons try to finish their mother's painting with tears streaming down their faces, Marcus finally understood what Keisha had been trying to tell him all along. Love wasn't something you adjusted to losing. It was something you carried forward, and his boys needed someone who understood that truth. Finding Keisha Williams proved harder than acquiring his last tech startup. Marcus had her address from employment records, but driving through East Austin at dawn felt like crossing into foreign territory. The contrast hit him like a physical blow. His Westlake Hills mansion could house 20 families from this neighborhood, yet somehow the modest apartments and chain-link fences radiated more warmth than his marble palace ever had. He parked his Tesla across from a weathered complex where children's bikes lay scattered in brown grass and laundry hung from second-story balconies. At 6 a.m., the parking lot was already alive with the quiet bustle of people heading to jobs that started before the sun fully rose. Marcus felt conspicuous in his $1,000 suit, a tourist in the world of people who worked 3 jobs to pay rent. That's when he saw her, emerging from the building in scrubs, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, carrying a thermos that had seen better years. But she wasn't alone. An elderly Latina woman leaned heavily on Keisha's arm, speaking rapid Spanish that Keisha answered with surprising fluency. Behind them, a young mother balanced a toddler on her hip while Keisha pressed something into her hand. Money, Marcus realized. Or maybe food stamps. He watched, transfixed, as Keisha helped Mrs. Rodriguez to a rusted Honda, ensuring she had her medications and her house keys before giving her a hug that lingered with genuine affection. Then she turned to the young mother, listened to rapid-fire explanations about daycare and work schedules, and somehow produced a business card from her scrubs pocket, probably a connection to childcare or another job. This was the woman he'd fired for caring too much about his children. When Keisha finally noticed his car, her face hardened with an expression Marcus had never seen before. Not anger exactly, but the kind of dignity that comes from surviving disappointment so many times it no longer surprises you. She walked over to his window with measured steps, her chin lifted in a way that reminded him suddenly of Sarah when she was preparing for a legal battle she intended to win. "Mr. Davidson," she said through the partially lowered glass, "you're a long way from Westlake Hills." Marcus killed the engine and stepped out, immediately regretting the decision as his Italian leather shoes met cracked asphalt. "I need to talk to you. I'm late for work." She turned toward an older Honda that had clearly seen better decades. "I picked up a night shift at Seton Medical. Some of us don't have the luxury of showing up late." "Please." The word came out rougher than he'd intended. 5 minutes. "That's all I'm asking." Keisha stopped, her hand on the car door handle. 5 minutes to what? Fire me again? Tell me how my faith is poison for your children. Explain why caring about 2 little boys who miss their mama makes me unfit to be in their lives. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks, shame, an emotion he'd almost forgotten existed. 5 minutes to apologize, to admit I was wrong about everything. Something shifted in Keisha's expression, but she didn't soften, not yet. Being sorry and being different are two separate things, Mr. Davidson. Which one are you? The question hung between them like a challenge. Marcus thought about his sons crying themselves to sleep, about Caleb's silence and Connor's bedwetting, and the way they'd both retreated so far into grief he couldn't reach them anymore. I found them in Sarah's studio last night, he said quietly, at 2 in the morning trying to finish her last painting. They said they couldn't remember her voice anymore, and they were scared they'd forget her completely. Keisha's hand dropped from the car door. Oh, those babies. They need you, Marcus continued, the words coming faster now, desperation leaking through his carefully maintained composure. I hired the best nanny agency in Austin could find, and she lasted 3 days. Said they were damaged goods. Connor had a complete breakdown in the grocery store yesterday, screaming for you in front of half of South Austin. And Caleb, his voice cracked. Caleb hasn't spoken since you left. Not a word. That boy's been carrying too much for too long, Keisha murmured, and Marcus caught a glimpse of the woman who'd knelt on his Persian rug with infinite patience, teaching his children that love could survive even death. I know you have conditions, Marcus said quickly, sensing an opening, and I'll meet them, all of them. No restrictions on how you care for them emotionally or spiritually. I won't interfere with bedtime prayers or talking about their mother or whatever else helps them heal. He stopped, struggling with words that felt foreign in his mouth. I don't know how to be their father without Sarah, and they're slipping away from me. Keisha studied his face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to trust pretty words without proof. What changed your mind? Because 2 weeks ago you were ready to call the police if I set foot on your property. Marcus thought about lying, spinning some corporate narrative about reassessing priorities and family values, but standing in this parking lot at dawn, surrounded by the honest poverty of people who worked hard for everything they had, the truth felt like the only currency worth offering. I've been angry at God since Sarah died, he said, angry that all those prayers didn't save her. Angry that faith failed when I needed it most. And when I saw you teaching my boys to pray, it felt like you were setting them up for the same disappointment, the same betrayal. And now I realize I wasn't protecting them from disappointment. I was protecting myself from hope. Marcus leaned against his car, suddenly exhausted. They need to remember their mother. They need to believe her love continues even though she's gone. And you gave them that gift while I was too busy nursing my own wounds to see it. Keisha was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on something beyond his shoulder. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. I'll come back, she said, but not as your employee, as their advocate. If I see you hurting those boys again, emotionally, spiritually, whatever, I'm gone for good, and I'll make sure everyone knows why. Relief flooded through Marcus so suddenly his knees nearly buckled. Thank you. God, thank you. Don't thank God yet, Keisha said with the first hint of a smile he'd seen. Thank him when your boys are sleeping through the night again and Caleb's talking your ear off about dinosaurs. The drive back to Westlake Hills felt different somehow, like he was returning to a house instead of a museum. Keisha followed in her Honda, and Marcus found himself checking his rearview mirror obsessively, terrified she might change her mind and disappear again. When they pulled into his circular driveway, both boys were pressed against the front window like puppies waiting for their owner to return. The moment Keisha stepped out of her car, they exploded through the front door with shrieks of joy that probably violated several noise ordinances. Miss Keisha! Miss Keisha! You came back! Connor reached her first, launching himself into her arms with the kind of desperate relief that made Marcus's chest tight. Caleb followed, wrapping his small arms around her waist and burying his face against her scrubs. "I missed you, baby, so much," Keisha whispered, gathering them both close. "Did you think I was gone forever?" "Daddy said you weren't coming back," Connor said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "He said we had to be strong and not cry about missing people." Marcus winced, remembering words that had seemed logical in his office but felt cruel in the morning light. "Well, your daddy was wrong about that," Keisha said gently, meeting Marcus's eyes over Connor's head. "It's okay to miss people you love. It means your heart is working just right." Caleb pulled back to look at her, his face serious with the weight of things he'd been carrying alone. "I was scared I'd forget Mama's voice like we forgot her smell on her pillows." "Oh, sweet boy." Keisha knelt to his level, her hands gentle on his shoulders. "Your Mama's voice isn't going anywhere. It lives right here." She touched his chest. "In all the love she put inside you before you were born, and whenever you need to hear it, you just listen real quiet, and it'll be there." "Can we pray to her today?" Connor asked. "Can we tell her we missed her?" Keisha glanced at Marcus, waiting for the inevitable objection. Instead, he nodded slowly, the gesture feeling like stepping off a cliff into unknown air. "I think," Marcus said carefully, "that sounds exactly like what we should do." That afternoon, as Keisha settled back into the rhythm of their household like she'd never left, Marcus found himself observing her methods with new eyes. He watched her teach the boys to fold laundry while singing old hymns, turning chores into connection. He listened as she helped them process their emotions through art, giving Connor crayons to draw his anger and Caleb paper to write letters to his mother. But it was during bedtime prayers that Marcus finally understood what he'd been so afraid of. Sitting on the edge of Caleb's bed while Keisha knelt between the twins' matching race car beds, he realized she wasn't teaching them to depend on fairy tales. She was teaching them that love could survive anything, even death, that their mother's influence could continue shaping them even from beyond the grave, that they were part of something larger than their own pain. "Thank you for bringing Miss Keisha back," Connor whispered to the ceiling, "and thank you for making Daddy not scared anymore." Marcus's throat tightened as he realized his son was right. The fear that had dominated his life for 2 years, fear of hoping, of believing, of letting love back in, had begun to loosen its grip. Not because his circumstances had changed, but because he'd finally stopped trying to control everything and started trusting the people who loved his children enough to stay. 3 weeks after Keisha's return, Marcus thought they'd found their new normal. The boys were sleeping through the night again. Caleb had started speaking in full sentences, and Connor's bedwetting had stopped. But normalcy, Marcus was about to learn, was a luxury families like theirs couldn't afford for long. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while Marcus sat in his home office, actually managing to focus on quarterly reports for the first time in months. His assistant's voice carried a tremor he'd never heard before. "Mr. Davidson, there are some people here to see you. They say they're from Dallas. The Ashfords." Marcus's blood turned to ice water. Richard and Patricia Ashford, Sarah's parents, who'd cut her off when she chose legal aid work over corporate law, who'd skipped their own daughter's funeral because they didn't approve of public displays of grief. He hadn't spoken to them since Sarah's death, and their sudden appearance could only mean trouble. He found them in his living room, looking like they'd stepped out of a Dallas Country Club magazine. Patricia perched on the edge of his Italian leather sofa as if it might contaminate her designer dress, while Richard stood by the window, surveying the house with the calculating gaze of someone appraising property. "Marcus," Patricia's voice could freeze bourbon, "we need to discuss the boys." "There's nothing to discuss," Marcus replied, remaining standing. "They're my sons." "Are they being raised properly?" Richard turned from the window, his silver hair gleaming in the afternoon light. "Because we've heard some concerning reports about the influences in this household." Marcus's jaw tightened. "What kind of influences?" Patricia opened her purse and withdrew a manila folder with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "We hired a private investigator, Marcus. We know about your breakdown after Sarah's death, the hospitalization, the suicide attempt you've kept so carefully hidden. We know about the domestic help you've allowed to fill our grandsons' heads with inappropriate religious notions." The room spun slightly. Marcus gripped the back of a chair, his knuckles white against the dark wood. "How dare you? How dare we protect our grandsons from an unstable environment?" Richard's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Patricia and I have been discussing this extensively with our attorneys. Those boys deserve better than a father who can't maintain his mental health and a hired girl who thinks she can replace their mother with primitive superstitions." "Keisha isn't hired help," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "She's—" "What? Family?" Patricia's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "She's domestic staff, Marcus. The fact that you've allowed her to overstep her boundaries to this degree only proves our point about your judgment." From upstairs came the sound of children's voices, Caleb and Connor playing some elaborate game involving dinosaurs and space travel, their laughter floating down like music. 6 months ago, that sound would have been impossible. Now these people wanted to destroy it. "The boys are thriving," Marcus said quietly. "For the first time since Sarah died, they're happy." "Happy?" Richard pulled out his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be photos. "Is this happiness? Our grandsons on their knees praying to a dead woman as if she were some kind of saint? Being taught that death is just another room to visit?" Marcus felt something cold and dangerous unfurling in his chest. "Those prayers help them process their grief." "Those prayers," Patricia stood, smoothing her skirt with sharp movements, "are preparing them for a lifetime of depending on fairy tales instead of facing reality. Sarah was always too soft, too idealistic. We won't stand by and watch our grandsons ruined the same way." "What are you saying?" Richard and Patricia exchanged a look that Marcus recognized from boardrooms just before hostile takeovers. "We're saying you have a choice," Richard announced. "Remove the religious influences from this house, all of them, or we'll file for emergency custody based on your documented mental instability and questionable childcare decisions." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "You can't be serious." "We've retained Pemberton Williams Associates," Patricia said, naming Dallas's most ruthless family law firm. "They specialize in cases where children's welfare is at stake. With your psychiatric history and the inappropriate boundary crossing you've allowed with staff, they're confident we have an excellent case." Marcus's mind raced through the implications. The Ashfords had money, old money, the kind that bought judges and influenced outcomes. They had connections throughout Texas legal circles, and they had one devastating weapon: the truth about his breakdown after Sarah's death. "The boys barely know you," he said desperately. "You haven't seen them since the funeral." "Which is exactly why they need proper guidance now, before it's too late," Richard replied. "We're offering you a chance to maintain custody, Marcus. All you have to do is fire the help and institute appropriate boundaries around religious instruction." "Her name is Keisha, and she's not going anywhere." Patricia tilted her head with the practiced sympathy of someone who'd never felt it genuinely. "Then I suppose we'll see you in court." "Our attorneys will file the emergency petition tomorrow morning." After they left, Marcus sat in his living room surrounded by the debris of his shattered peace. The boys' voices still drifted down from upstairs, unaware that their world was about to explode again. He thought about calling his lawyer, then realized with sick certainty that corporate attorneys who handled tech acquisitions were useless against family court predators. When Keisha found him an hour later, He was still sitting in the same chair, staring at nothing. "Mr. Davidson, the boys are asking about dinner, and you look like you've seen a ghost." He looked up at her, really looked, saw the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her posture, the love that radiated from her like warmth from a fire. How had he ever mistaken her for just hired help? How had he been so blind to what she'd become to his family? "Sarah's parents were here," he said simply. Understanding flickered across her face immediately. "What did they want?" "You gone. Me declared unfit. The boys removed from what they consider an inappropriate environment." Keisha sat down across from him, her movements careful and deliberate. "And what are you going to do?" Marcus had built his fortune by making hard choices quickly, cutting losses before they could destroy him. Every business instinct screamed at him to minimize damage, to negotiate a settlement that preserved what he could. Give up Keisha, institute the Ashfords' approved religious instruction, maintain custody through compromise. But looking at this woman who'd brought his sons back from the edge of despair, who'd taught them that love could survive even death, who'd shown him what faith looked like when it was lived instead of preached, the choice wasn't hard at all. "We fight," he said. "Together, all of us." Keisha's eyes glistened. "That could mean losing everything." "I've already lost everything once," Marcus replied. "I'm not doing it again. Not when I finally understand what's worth fighting for." That evening, after the boys were asleep, Marcus and Keisha sat at his kitchen table with legal pads and laptops, preparing for a battle that would determine not just custody, but the very definition of family. Outside, Austin twinkled with lights from thousands of homes where people were living ordinary lives, unaware that in one Westlake Hills mansion, everything was about to change. "They'll come after both of us," Keisha warned, her pen moving across paper as she made notes. "My background, my faith, every mistake I've ever made." "Then we'd better make sure we're ready for them," Marcus replied, already composing emails to attorneys who specialized in cases the Ashfords' lawyers thought they could never lose. Neither of them mentioned the obvious truth hanging between them. They were about to wage war against people with unlimited resources and powerful connections, and the collateral damage would be two little boys who'd already lost too much. But some fights chose you regardless of the odds, and sometimes the only way to protect what mattered was to risk losing it all. The custody hearing took place in a sterile courtroom that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams. Marcus sat at the defendant's table, a position he'd never imagined occupying, while the Ashfords' legal team arranged their arsenal of documents like weapons on a battlefield. Their lead attorney, Margaret Pemberton, was a silver-haired woman whose reputation for destroying families in the name of protecting children preceded her like a deadly perfume. Judge Catherine Martinez presided with the weary expression of someone who'd seen too many families torn apart by grief and greed. At 55, she'd been on the family court bench for 15 years, long enough to spot manufactured outrage from genuine concern. But the Ashfords had chosen their battlefield carefully. Judge Martinez was known for her conservative rulings and suspicion of unconventional childcare arrangements. The boys sat in the hallway with a court-appointed guardian, blissfully unaware that their future was being decided by strangers who measured love in legal precedents and financial statements. Marcus had tried to explain the situation without terrifying them, but how do you tell 6-year-olds that their grandparents, people they'd met twice in their lives, wanted to take them away from the only home they'd ever known? Pemberton rose for her opening statement with the confidence of a prosecutor who'd never lost a case. "Your Honor, we're here today because 2 innocent children are being raised in an environment that prioritizes the emotional needs of adults over the welfare of minors." The defendant, Marcus Davidson, suffered a complete psychological breakdown following his wife's death, a breakdown so severe it required psychiatric hospitalization and suicide intervention. Marcus felt the words hit him like physical blows, each revelation stripping away another layer of privacy he'd fought to maintain. Around him, court reporters typed mechanically, creating a permanent record of his darkest moments. Rather than seeking appropriate professional help for his children, Pemberton continued, Mr. Davidson has instead allowed his domestic employee to assume a parental role for which she is wholly unqualified. This woman, Keisha Williams, has no formal training in child psychology, no credentials in grief counseling, and no business making decisions about the spiritual and emotional development of traumatized children. She gestured toward a stack of photographs that made Marcus's stomach lurch. The evidence shows Mr. Davidson's sons engaged in religious rituals under Mrs. Williams' guidance, children on their knees, hands clasped in prayer, being taught to communicate with their deceased mother, as if death were merely a different form of conversation. This isn't healthy grief processing, Your Honor. This is magical thinking that will leave these boys unprepared for the realities of life. Patricia Ashford took the stand next, dressed in navy blue that screamed respectability and old money. Under Pemberton's careful questioning, she painted a picture of concerned grandparents forced to intervene because their son-in-law had abdicated his responsibilities to unsuitable help. Sarah was always too emotional, too idealistic, Patricia testified, her voice carrying just the right note of maternal concern. She chose social work over a proper legal career, married beneath her station, and filled her head with romantic notions about helping the less fortunate. We can't allow our grandsons to follow the same destructive path. And what would you provide that Mr. Davidson cannot? Pemberton asked. Stability, structure, appropriate religious instruction at our family's Presbyterian church, where they'll learn proper values and associate with children from good families. Private school, summer camps, exposure to the kind of opportunities that build character and prepare young men for success. Marcus's attorney, a scrappy family law specialist named David Chen, rose for cross-examination with fire in his eyes. Mrs. Ashford, when did you last see your grandsons before this custody petition? Patricia's composure flickered slightly. The funeral. But we were grieving. 2 years ago. And how many times have you called to check on their welfare in those 2 years? We sent birthday cards. How many phone calls, Mrs. Ashford? We thought it best to allow Marcus time to process his grief. Chen moved in like a shark sensing blood. Isn't it true that you disapproved of your daughter's career choices, her marriage, and her decision to live in Austin rather than Dallas? We wanted what was best for Sarah. And isn't it true that you refused to attend her law school graduation because she chose legal aid work over corporate law? Pemberton objected, but the damage was spreading. Chen continued his methodical dismantling of the Ashfords' facade, revealing them as grandparents motivated more by control than love, more interested in social status than their grandson's well-being. When Keisha took the stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably. She wore her best dress, a simple navy blue that emphasized her dignity without pretension, and spoke with the quiet strength that had sustained her through years of caring for other people's children while her own dreams remained deferred. Miss Williams, Pemberton began, her tone dripping with condescension, you have no formal training in child psychology, correct? That's correct? No degree in early childhood development? No, ma'am. No certification in grief counseling or trauma therapy? No, ma'am. Pemberton smiled like a predator closing in for the kill. Yet you took it upon yourself to provide religious instruction to traumatized children despite their father's explicit prohibition. Keisha lifted her chin with quiet dignity. I took it upon myself to love 2 little boys who were drowning in grief that no one was helping them process. By teaching them to pray to a dead woman, by teaching them that love doesn't end with death, that their mama's love for them is permanent, even if her physical presence isn't. That it's okay to miss someone, and still find joy in living. And you believe you're qualified to make such determinations? I believe, Keisha said, her voice growing stronger, that any adult who loves a child is qualified to help them heal. Qualification isn't just about degrees and certificates. Sometimes it's about showing up every day, about listening when they cry, about holding them when nightmares come. Sometimes it's about teaching them that their feelings matter, that their memories are treasures, and that the people we love never really leave us. The courtroom fell silent, except for the soft scratching of the court reporter's machine. Even Pemberton seemed momentarily thrown by the simple eloquence of Keisha's response. "Ms. Williams," Judge Martinez interjected, her voice gentler than it had been all day, "can you describe your relationship with the deceased mother, Sarah Davidson?" Keisha's eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady. "Mrs. Davidson was more than an employer. She was like a sister to me. We met through the legal aid clinic where she worked. She helped my family navigate some difficult times, and when she needed help with the boys, she asked me to come work for them. Not as just a caregiver, but as someone she trusted to love her children if something happened to her." "Did she discuss her concerns about her health with you?" "Yes, ma'am. She knew the pregnancy was high risk. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd help Mr. Davidson understand that the boys needed to remember her, not forget her. She said, 'Grief shared is grief that heals, but grief hidden becomes poison.'" Judge Martinez made notes, her expression thoughtful. When Chen rose for redirect examination, he had only one question. "Ms. Williams, in your opinion, are Caleb and Connor Davidson better off now than they were 6 months ago?" Keisha's answer came without hesitation. 6 months ago, Caleb wouldn't speak and Connor was wetting the bed every night from anxiety. They were scared all the time, walking on eggshells around their daddy's grief. Now Caleb talks my ear off about dinosaurs and space travel. Connor sleeps through the night and laughs at his own jokes. They know their mama loved them, they know their daddy loves them, and they know it's safe to feel whatever they're feeling. "No further questions," Chen said, returning to his seat with quiet satisfaction. But the day's testimony had taken its toll. As court adjourned for the weekend, Marcus realized that legal victories weren't won through truth or love or what was best for children. They were won through manipulation of facts, exploitation of vulnerabilities, and the systematic destruction of anyone who stood in the way. The Ashfords had money, connections, and a legal system that valued appearances over reality. And despite everything they'd fought for, Marcus wasn't sure it would be enough. The revelation came not with fanfare or dramatic courtroom theatrics, but through a manila envelope that arrived at Marcus's doorstep on Saturday morning, hand-delivered by a courier who vanished before anyone could sign for it. Inside were medical records, DNA test results, and a letter written in shaking handwriting that would shatter everything the Ashfords thought they knew about their family. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, coffee growing cold as he stared at documents that read like a genetic confession. The letterhead belonged to Seton Medical Center's genealogy department, but the story it told reached back 60 years to a Dallas mansion where secrets had been buried under layers of social respectability and Southern propriety. Keisha found him there an hour later, papers spread around him like pieces of a puzzle that finally revealed its terrible picture. "Mr. Davidson, the boys are asking about pancakes, and you look like you've seen—" She stopped, recognizing the medical formatting of the documents. "What is this?" "DNA test results," Marcus said quietly, his voice hollow with shock. "Ordered by your mother's insurance company as part of her Alzheimer's treatment plan. Standard genetic screening to rule out hereditary factors." Keisha sank into the chair across from him, her face pale. "I don't understand." Marcus picked up a photograph, black and white, dated 1962. It showed a young woman in a maid's uniform standing beside a toddler with familiar eyes. Your grandmother, Essie Williams, worked as a housekeeper for the Ashford family in the early 1960s. She was 19 when she gave birth to your mother. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to voice. The DNA results show a 23.4% genetic match between you and the boys, Marcus continued, his words clinical and precise, as if distance could diminish their impact. That makes you their half-aunt, Sarah's half-niece, the daughter of Sarah's half-sister. Keisha's hands trembled as she reached for the photograph. Richard Ashford had an affair with your grandmother while his wife was visiting relatives in Houston. Your grandmother was fired when her pregnancy became obvious, but not before Patricia Ashford figured out exactly whose child she was carrying. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The Ashfords' immediate hostility toward Keisha hadn't been just about class or race. It had been about buried shame, family secrets that threatened their carefully constructed image of respectability. "They knew," Keisha whispered, "when they saw me in your house. They knew who I was." "Which explains why they waited until now to challenge custody," Marcus said grimly. "They thought they could discredit you as unfit help. They never expected genetic testing to reveal what they'd spent 60 years hiding." From upstairs came the sound of small feet racing down the hallway, followed by Connor's voice calling for breakfast. Normal sounds from a normal Saturday morning, completely at odds with the bombshell exploding in the kitchen. "What does this mean for the case?" Keisha asked. Marcus gathered the papers with hands that shook slightly. "It means everything just changed. They can't argue you're unqualified to care for the boys when you're their blood relative. They can't paint you as an outsider when you're more family than they are, genetically speaking." But even as he said it, Marcus understood the deeper implications. This revelation would destroy the Ashfords' reputation, expose decades of hypocrisy about family values and racial purity. People like Richard and Patricia Ashford didn't surrender quietly when their social standing was threatened. Monday morning arrived with the brittle clarity of a glass about to shatter. The courthouse buzzed with unusual energy. Word had leaked about new evidence in the Davidson case, though no one knew exactly what bombshell was about to explode. Judge Martinez called the court to order, her expression suggesting she'd been briefed on the morning's developments. The Ashfords sat rigidly at their table, Patricia's face carved from marble, Richard's jaw clenched so tight Marcus wondered if he might crack teeth. David Chen rose with the deliberate movements of a man who held winning cards. "Your Honor, we have new evidence that fundamentally changes the nature of this custody dispute. Evidence that reveals the true relationship between Mrs. Keisha Williams and the minor children in question." Pemberton shot to her feet. "Objection." "We weren't notified of any new evidence. The evidence arrived over the weekend," Chen replied smoothly. "DNA test results ordered by medical insurance, not by either party in this case. Public record, completely admissible." Judge Martinez reviewed the documents with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to expect surprises in family court, but nothing quite like this. When she looked up, her expression had shifted from judicial neutrality to barely concealed amazement. "Miss Williams," she said carefully, "were you aware of your genetic relationship to the Davidson children?" "No, Your Honor," Keisha replied, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "I knew my grandmother worked for wealthy families in Dallas, but she never talked about specifics, said some stories were better left buried." Judge Martinez turned to the Ashfords' table. "Mr. and Mrs. Ashford, did you know about this family connection when you filed your custody petition?" The silence stretched like a taut wire. Patricia's face had gone ashen, while Richard stared at the table as if it might offer escape from the courthouse that had become a courtroom of reckoning. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. We suspected there might be similarities, family resemblances. You suspected? Chen's voice carried the righteous indignation of someone who'd just been handed ammunition for a moral war. You mean you knew that Keisha Williams was your grandson's biological aunt when you tried to have her declared unfit to care for them? We didn't know for certain, but you knew enough to recognize her grandmother's features in her face, enough to remember the woman you fired for carrying your husband's child, enough to understand exactly why Sarah felt such an immediate connection to Keisha. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Court reporters typed frantically while spectators craned their necks to get better views of the drama unfolding before them. Judge Martinez banged her gavel repeatedly. Order! I will have order in this courtroom. But order was the last thing anyone wanted now. The truth had a momentum of its own, rolling downhill like an avalanche that swept away everything in its path. Pemberton made one last desperate attempt to salvage her client's case. Your Honor, regardless of genetic relationships, the fundamental concerns remain. Mr. Davidson's mental health history, his inappropriate delegation of parental authority to his son's aunt, Chen interrupted, to a blood relative who has been caring for them with the kind of love and dedication that comes naturally to family. A woman who, unlike my clients, has been present for these children every single day since they needed her most. Judge Martinez held up her hand for silence. I'm going to call a recess while I review all the evidence. When we reconvene in 1 hour, I'll render my decision. The recess felt like waiting for execution results. Marcus and Keisha sat in the hallway while the boys played quietly with coloring books, unaware that their lives hung in the balance of judicial deliberation. Around them, lawyers huddled in urgent conferences and reporters made phone calls to editors who sensed a story that would dominate Texas headlines for weeks. Are you okay? Marcus asked Keisha, who sat staring at her hands with the stunned expression of someone whose entire identity had shifted in a single morning. I keep thinking about my grandmother, she said softly. All those years she cleaned houses and raised other people's children, never talking about where she came from or why she left Dallas so suddenly. She carried that secret her whole life. Maybe she was protecting you, or maybe she was protecting them. Keisha nodded toward the courtroom where the Ashfords waited for judgment. She knew what would happen if the truth came out. The scandal, the shame, the way it would destroy their precious reputation. When court reconvened, Judge Martinez looked like a woman who'd aged years in an hour. She'd clearly wrestled with precedent and law, balancing genetic relationships against established custody arrangements, considering what was best for children caught in a web of adult deception. After reviewing all evidence, she began, her voice carrying the weight of Solomon's wisdom, this court finds that the custody petition filed by Richard and Patricia Ashford lacks merit and is hereby dismissed. Relief flooded through Marcus so suddenly he thought he might faint. Beside him, Keisha exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. But Judge Martinez wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court orders immediate revision of the custody arrangement to reflect the newly discovered family relationships. Keisha Williams is hereby granted legal guardianship rights as the children's biological aunt, with full authority to make decisions regarding their care, education, and spiritual guidance. The Ashfords section of the courtroom exploded in outrage, but their protests were drowned out by the judge's final pronouncement. This court also recommends a full investigation into potential fraud charges related to the deliberate concealment of material facts in this custody petition. As the gavel fell for the final time, Marcus understood that they hadn't just won custody. They'd won the right to define family on their own terms. Not through money or social status or the artificial boundaries of race and class, but through love, commitment, and the kind of bonds that survived even death. Outside the courthouse, as reporters shouted questions and cameras flashed, Marcus gathered his sons in his arms while Keisha stood beside them, not as hired help, not as an outsider looking in, but as family, legal family, chosen family, the only kind that really mattered. "Are we going home now?" Caleb asked, his small voice cutting through the chaos. "Yes," Marcus said, looking at Keisha with gratitude that had no words. "We're all going home." 6 months after the courthouse victory that had made headlines across Texas, the Davidson house had transformed into something Sarah would have recognized. Not just a home, but a sanctuary, where love grew in the spaces between laughter and tears, where family was defined not by blood alone, but by the daily choice to show up for each other. Marcus stood in the kitchen on a Saturday morning in spring, watching Keisha teach the boys to make Sarah's famous cinnamon rolls, a recipe that had been lost until they'd found it tucked inside her old cookbook, written in her careful script alongside notes about extra love and patience for rising. The irony wasn't lost on him. They'd all needed time to rise, to become the family they were meant to be. "Daddy, look!" Connor held up hands covered in flour, grinning with the kind of uninhibited joy that had seemed impossible 2 years ago. "I'm helping make Mama's favorite breakfast." "I can see that," Marcus laughed, reaching for the camera that had become a permanent fixture on the counter. Where once he'd avoided capturing moments that might become painful memories, now he documented everything. Bedtime stories, art projects, the way Caleb's face scrunched when he concentrated, the sound of Connor's giggle when Keisha tickled him during bath time. The changes hadn't been dramatic or sudden. They'd come in waves like healing always did, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, until gradually the forward steps outnumbered the retreats. Caleb now spoke constantly, making up for years of silence with elaborate stories about dinosaur adventures and space exploration. Connor had stopped his hyper-vigilant watching, no longer scanning adult faces for signs of impending abandonment. And Marcus had learned to pray. Not the formal recitations of his Methodist childhood, but the honest conversations with Sarah that Keisha had modeled, talking to his wife about the boys' progress, asking for guidance when parenting felt impossible, expressing gratitude for second chances he'd never expected to receive. The legal victory had brought unexpected consequences. The story of the secret family connection had dominated Texas media for weeks, sparking conversations about race, class, and the true meaning of family that reached far beyond their personal experience. The Ashfords had retreated to their Dallas mansion in disgrace, their reputation in tatters, their social standing destroyed by revelations of hypocrisy that ran generations deep. But perhaps the most surprising outcome had been the flood of support from unexpected quarters. Other families dealing with custody battles, interfaith relationships, and non-traditional caregiving arrangements reached out, sharing their own stories of love that transcended conventional boundaries. Marcus found himself becoming an unlikely advocate for family diversity, speaking at conferences about the legal recognition of chosen family bonds. "Mr. Davidson," Keisha called from the stove, where she was demonstrating the art of rolling dough without tearing it, "could you get the butter from the refrigerator? And maybe change out of that business suit before you get flour all over it?" Marcus looked down, surprised to find himself still dressed for the board meeting he'd attended that morning, a meeting that had ended early because his partners understood that Saturday afternoon family time was now sacred, non-negotiable territory. He changed into jeans and a t-shirt that Connor had decorated with fabric markers, bearing the legend "World's Okayest Dad" in rainbow letters. It had become his favorite shirt, not despite the modest praise, but because of it. Okayest felt honest, achievable, human in a way that superlatives never had. When he returned to the kitchen, he found Keisha had set up a learning moment around measurements and fractions, turning cookie preparation into an impromptu math lesson that the boys absorbed without realizing they were being taught. It was her gift, the ability to nurture growth in any environment, to find teachable moments in the mundane activities of daily life. "Miss Keisha," Caleb said, carefully measuring vanilla extract, "will you still live with us when we're grown up?" The question hung in the air with the weight of childhood anxiety about permanence, about the people they loved staying put long enough to become memory anchors rather than sources of loss. "Well," Keisha said thoughtfully, continuing to roll dough as she spoke, "I imagine when you're grown up, you'll have your own families to take care of." "But family isn't something you outgrow, sweet boy. It just gets bigger." "Like how we're family now even though we didn't know we were before?" Connor asked. "Exactly like that. Love makes family, not just blood. And love doesn't have an expiration date." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotions that still surprised him in their intensity. 2 years ago, he would have dismissed such conversations as sentimental nonsense, inappropriate boundary crossing by hired help. Now he understood them as the foundation work of emotional intelligence, the careful construction of security that would allow his sons to love fearlessly as adults. The afternoon unfolded with the gentle chaos of family life, cinnamon rolls that emerged from the oven golden and perfect. A living room fort built from couch cushions and dreams, bedtime stories that stretched longer than scheduled because no one wanted the day to end. As Marcus tucked Connor into bed, his son's sleepy voice delivered an observation that stopped his heart with its simple profundity. "Daddy, I think Mama sent Miss Keisha to us." "What makes you say that?" "Because she knew we'd need someone to teach us how to be happy without her. And Miss Keisha knows all the same songs Mama used to sing." Later that night, after the boys had finally settled into sleep and the house had found its quiet rhythm, Marcus and Keisha sat on the back porch with glasses of tea, watching fireflies dance in the warm Texas air. It had become their ritual, these late conversations that processed the day's events and planned for tomorrow's possibilities. "I've been thinking about something," Marcus said, his words careful in the way they became when he was approaching territory that mattered deeply. "About making this official." Keisha turned to look at him, eyebrows raised in question. "Not marriage," he clarified quickly, seeing her expression. "Though you know you've spoiled me for anyone else's cooking." The joke earned him a gentle laugh, but he pressed on, suddenly serious. "I mean legal adoption, making you their official mother, not just their guardian." The suggestion settled between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. Keisha was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the condensation of her glass. "That's a big step," she said finally, "for all of us. The biggest, but also the most honest one." Marcus leaned forward, his voice gaining conviction. "You're already their mother in every way that matters. You know their fears, their dreams, their favorite bedtime stories. You've held them through nightmares and celebrated their victories. You've loved them through grief and taught them to carry joy alongside sorrow." "And what about Sarah?" The question that had lurked unspoken in every conversation about the future, the concern that honoring one mother might somehow diminish another. "Sarah chose you," Marcus said simply. "Long before any of us understood why, she chose you to love these boys when she couldn't. Making that choice legal doesn't erase her. It honors her faith in you." Keisha's eyes glistened with tears that caught the porch light like stars. "I'd be honored," she whispered, "to be their mama officially, to be your family in the eyes of the law." They sat in comfortable silence after that, listening to the night sounds of suburban Austin, air conditioners humming, dogs barking in distant yards, the faint sound of music from a neighbor's party. Ordinary sounds of ordinary people living ordinary lives, beautiful in their mundane simplicity. "You know what I realized today?" Marcus said as they prepared to go inside. "When Connor asked if you'd still be here when they're grown up, I couldn't imagine this family without you anymore. Not just as their caregiver or even their legal mother, but as my partner in this impossible, beautiful work of raising human beings who know they're loved." The adoption papers were filed the following Monday, beginning a process that would take months to complete, but felt inevitable as sunrise. The boys threw themselves into planning the celebration they insisted would be necessary once Keisha became official mama, a party that would include cinnamon rolls, dinosaur-themed decorations, and invitations to every person who had supported their unconventional family through its formation. As summer approached and the one-year anniversary of the custody battle neared, Marcus found himself marveling at the distance they'd traveled from that first explosive confrontation over bedtime prayers. The boys now talked to Sarah every night, sharing their days and their dreams with the easy confidence of children who believed love survived everything, even death. He'd learned to join those conversations, adding his own words to their gentle communion with memory and hope. The Davidson family had become something unprecedented in his experience. Not perfect, but whole. Not conventional, but complete. Not defined by loss, but transformed by the courage to love beyond the boundaries of grief, race, and traditional expectations. And in the quiet moments before sleep, Marcus whispered his own prayers now. Not requests for what he wanted, but gratitude for what he'd been given. A second chance at fatherhood. Sons who laughed more than they cried. A partner who understood that healing happened not through forgetting, but through remembering with love instead of pain. Most of all, he gave thanks for the woman who'd knelt on his Persian rug 2 years ago and taught his children that love was stronger than death, that family was bigger than blood, and that sometimes the most important conversations happened on our knees, with our hearts open to possibilities we'd never imagined. The sound that had once stopped his heart, his sons saying amen, had become the sweetest music he'd ever heard. Sometimes life breaks us open in ways we never expected. Marcus Davidson thought he had all the answers: success, control, logic over emotion. But when grief shattered his carefully constructed world, he discovered that healing doesn't come from having all the right qualifications or the perfect plan. It comes from the courage to let love back in, even when it arrives wearing an unexpected face. This story reminds us that family isn't just about blood, it's about who shows up when the world falls apart. It's about second chances we never saw coming, about finding strength in vulnerability and discovering that sometimes our greatest blessings arrive disguised as disruptions to our plans. At 55, 65, or beyond, we're never too old to learn that walls built from pain can become bridges when we're ready to cross them. The most profound transformations happen not when we have everything figured out, but when we finally admit we need help carrying the load. Share your thoughts. Have you ever experienced an unexpected person who changed your family's story for the better? What moment taught you that love comes in forms you never anticipated? Drop a comment below and let us know how second chances have shaped your own journey.